And so I was a bit of the weirdo in my family. My mom blames it on the fact that they pronounced my name Amanda instead of Amanda, number one. And then she binged on green olives during her pregnancy. So she now, feels very guilty about that. And as a mother now of two teenagers, I can't even imagine what that would be like to have your kid move so far away. But here I am, and my work is very global. So I'll tell you about that in a minute. But I don't spend a lot of time in Spain working. Most of my time, I spend a lot of time in airports, about a week in London a year. I'm in the US frequently, just got back from New York as well. And the reason is, so I work with in kind of three areas. The main thing is I have an advisory practice working with global 100, 500 companies on their large scale strategy on learning and the skills piece as well, and the tech that enables it. So companies like Google or HSBC, Novartis, some of the big organizations out there. And so I just go where they are, essentially, when it can't be done on Zoom.
Which is
but
everywhere.
I also, yeah, exactly.
Why you're always online.
Lots of, I don't know if my carbon footprint is that great, but I like to think that it's for a good cause. In addition to the consulting work I do around technology, learning, and skills for these companies, I also work very closely with a lot of the providers that are building the technology solutions to enable the workforce to learn at scale and pace. And so I really enjoy that work a lot as well. I have kind of a mixed background as a practitioner, but also on the vendor side. So I love helping them, making sure that their products are going to actually create a greater impact and, obviously sell as well, because if they don't sell, then they're not going to help people. So that's kind of door number two. And then finally, I work a bit on the investment space as well, helping investors make investment decisions, M&As, due diligence, that kind of thing. And I'm a venture partner at Emerge Education, which is a fund specialized in early stage investment in the future of education based in London.
Well, so, I don't know how you have time to also be raising two teenage kids, but it sounds incredible.
Well, I love what I do. I really do. I'm very purpose driven and I'm not bored ever. So it doesn't feel like work most of the time, except for today when I had to do my taxes, my tax return. That's never fun.
Well, I think a lot of people are sharing your pain. Well, look, Amanda, one of the things that I thought was really interesting, we have a lot of people that are in the learning field. And as you know, given what you do, the amount of technology, the amount of change that's happening, and the amount that practitioners just have to get a handle around in order to really deploy large-scale learning strategies for companies like you work with, has gotten very complex. And given that you've done that work with some of the largest global companies, I'd love for you to share, whether it's a specific initiative or, broader based programs that you've done with them, and maybe unpack that a bit for folks here. Like, how do these learning strategies get designed and deployed and scaled? What are those considerations that companies should be thinking about?
That's a really, really big question, and it's a difficult one to answer. I'd say, no two companies are alike, and just the nature of the way we work with them is it's very flexible. So it takes a lot of shapes and forms. I'd say right now, what's most exciting to me is where organizations are really seeing the need to move towards skills-based organizations. And I know that there's a lot of noise, and maybe, it can be interpreted as hype around this, but I really do believe that it represents a seismic shift in the way work is done, because it allows us to look at people, what they can do versus what they say they can do on their resumes and their degrees. It also unlocks the opportunity to move people around in different projects and be more agile with a lowercase a as well. But in order to do that, you really have to know, okay, well, what are the skills that the company has? And that's no small task. So what's that inventory? And then where are we trying to go as an organization? Where are the gaps, right? And then on a more granular basis, what is then the strategy to try to have a plan to guide people towards the learning and development opportunities to close the gaps where it's needed. And by the way, I skipped a step because actually it needs to be joined up with the full talent strategy, because it's not always the best idea to develop talent internally. Sometimes it is better to go out on the market and acquire. So talent acquisition and learning development need to be working really in lockstep. So getting HR is traditionally and still in most companies very, very siloed. It drives me up the wall. I think it's a really bad idea for this to be the case. So you've got, talent management over here and learning and development here. And then actually leadership development is its own swim lane, which I do not understand, because isn't it just learning for everybody? And so I think starting first of all to say, what is the end-to-end plan, strategy, and then experience on the individual level as well. And then from there, if we do believe that skills are the way to go, so that not everyone agrees with me, but assuming all of you listening are, well, at least hear me out, then the starting point there is, well, what is the skills taxonomy that we're starting with? And so in the past, companies would build, these very intricate competency frameworks, and even some are trying to build these skills frameworks manually. And what is quite exciting right now, and I'm a tech geek, is that now there's new technology that can crowdsource from the market all these skills, and even industry specific, and give companies a starting place, because it's just not feasible to have to build a skills taxonomy and maintain that, especially now with the exponential pace of change that we're seeing in the world in general and work in particular. So I know this all sounds pretty abstract, but really what it's about, it's saying, okay, I've got this need in my company, for example, a large hardware company that we were working with, that I can't actually share for NDA reasons, but they had all these sellers, right, that were used to selling computers and physical things, and now they had to become consultative sellers and sell services. This is a total shift. And by the way, they had to be very savvy in terms of the technology and all of the new developments there. And so this one's quite easy. It's at least they're sellers that are still going to be sellers. Sometimes the transformation is much more dramatic, exactly. But in this case, it's, well, what are the skills they need? And then let's assess, if we can, these people to figure out what's their level to begin with. That's really, I will say, a challenge that a lot of organizations are struggling to crack right now, is how do we measure the starting place for, right? But once again, there's tons of startups emerging in this space that I think are very promising and are going to help us do it at scale. So really my advice is, to start with an MVP, a minimum viable product, figure out, where you have a gap, where it makes sense to develop these people internally versus go out in the market and acquire that talent. And then what is the journey? What needs to be done? And finally, the last thing is what technology needs to be implemented to enable that, not first, which most companies tend to do, as I'm sure, working with organizations.
Yeah, actually, well, you answered one of my questions, which was, where are you seeing people maybe get stuck? And so it sounds like, thinking technology first versus outcome and what you're trying to drive first, and then having the technology fit into that. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, definitely a tech first approach is something that I see again and again. Trying to boil the ocean and map out biting off too much at once, rather than starting with a use case and then, iterating and building on that. I think that's another common mistake. What were you going to say, Christine?
Well, you actually touched on it, which is, we've also seen, it feels overwhelming, right? Even this idea of cataloging and understanding and just getting the picture of the skills that are in your workforce and where they need to go. I guess my thought was really that, how do you balance managing to an MVP and being able to really start to get in there and use a use case to better understand what it is that you need, against this broader idea that your different functions need to be more holistically working together, and there's this whole strategy you should be supporting. oftentimes I think that's where people get stuck. They worry that if you start too small, you won't be able to scale to the big. If you start too big, you can get overwhelmed and hard to bring it down into the actual application. Any
Yeah.
advice there or any
I
learning you've
think
had there?
that's where stakeholder management is really, really important. And I do believe to start smaller is the best approach. But then you need to make sure that you have a baseline to start with and that you're able to measure the impact of the initiative that you've had. So for, you to be able to demonstrate we have upskilled this many people. We've reduced the time to competence for those sellers that I was talking about before, because then you have the data, because without data, it's just an opinion.
Yep.
And data is our superpower to then be able to build a business case to get more people on board internally, because the change management has got to start within the L&D and the HR function, right? And then get investment as well to roll out this approach on a larger scale, because it takes money. And unfortunately, L&D in a lot of companies is still really seen as a cost center rather than a strategic investment.
Is that something you help companies articulate or think about?
Absolutely.
Anything
Absolutely.
you can share around what you've seen to be effective and what?
Yeah, I think honestly, there's so much you can learn from basic sales where, it's stakeholder management. So what's in it for them, each person, to map out your stakeholders internally as if it was a sales plan, and qualify what is do you really think you have an opportunity to move forward with your initiative, right? Are there detractors? Are there people that are going to torpedo your plan? And if so, what can you do about that, right? Who are your advocates and your champions? And then, like I said before, with L&D too, L&D for the learning for the sake of learning. I mean, I think we're all in this because we believe it's important, but it's not good enough for a company. Most companies, they're not NGOs, and they want to understand how this drives business performance and results. And so it's our job as well to look at what the business strategy is and reverse engineer from there and figure out to find a hook. So what are the biggest burning business challenges that we can start with to demonstrate that this can make a difference, right?
I love that anecdote of the parallel to sales. Of course, I come from a sales background and I
Yep.
run my company. And so sales is always very top of mind for me. But one of the things in sales is, and this a lot also from the investor side, is it a vitamin or is it a painkiller?
Yeah.
And you're always looking for your solution to be a painkiller. But I
Yep.
hadn't thought of applying that same idea to initiatives internally, right? How do you ensure that the program that you are, presenting or proposing, or the technology, is really a painkiller for that organization and being able to make
Exactly.
a story?
And I have no doubt, Christine, that you can't help yourself. And when you work with companies, you are probably applying a lot of the sales skills that you have without thinking about it. But for some reason, L&D leaders seem to be sort of allergic to sales. And I think it's actually a really important, talking about skills, a really important skill set to have if you want to drive any impactful change.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, all of us are trying to, whether you call it sell or influence a
Exactly.
decision or share a perspective to be able to broaden how someone thinks, it all comes down to what I think are pretty basic and fundamental sales skills, right?
Mhm.
And so it is interesting. Also ties back to your idea of, it's not necessarily that someone has to be a salesperson. There's these fundamental skill sets that are valuable for every function, right? Another plug for why maybe companies need
Mhm.
to be thinking more about skills versus just the job or a function.
Yeah, well, speaking of plugs, a shameless one. So my LinkedIn Learning course that I put out a few years ago in the pandemic, don't watch that one, but the new revamped version
Okay.
is coming out in a couple of weeks. And there's actually a section of that that's devoted to sales techniques as applied to building a business case and getting internal buy-in for initiatives in L&D.
Oh, okay. Well,
I'll
you
share
heard
it
it
with
here
you when it's
first,
live.
everyone, right? Once you have that out, please let us know. And I'm sure people will be very interested to pick up a few tips and ways that can apply those skills in their own work. Okay, well, I'm going to shift gears a little bit. We talked a little bit about business impact, but could you share a story around either initiatives that you've seen some of these large companies deploy and what ended up being the impact that they were able to see out of it that was particularly powerful? Oftentimes, I think when people talk about business impact, you might get you tend to get focused on, well, I need this metric, or I need, to show cost savings or things like that. But I'd love for you to share maybe a specific story around how the companies themselves are thinking about impact. Is it what I shared? Like, is that what people should be managing too? Or are they thinking differently about that?
I'm trying to think of a good example because I agree with you. I think stories are really powerful. So you have to manage on the one hand the numbers, but it doesn't always have to be about cost or certainly not cost savings. In general, I like to say you should try to demonstrate that your initiative is either making money, saving money, or mitigating risk, but then also to make it really human. And, how has it made a difference for an employee in a company? And so just a story around, because of the skills-based approach, I did some work to identify what my gaps were. And then I focused on developing those. And thanks to, there's a stretch project that I was able to do because of this talent mobility initiative, for example. And therefore, I got a promotion. I was able to move to a different country. I'm trying to think of a name and a face right now, and none is coming to mind, but there's so many stories like that. And so for companies to just basic, table stakes, if they can get their employees to feel more engaged, to be able to attract better, more talented workers and retain them, that is very powerful as well. And there's usually no shortage of stories that can make that come alive.
Yeah, I mean, we see the same thing as well, where, certainly companies have the metrics that they're looking at, whether it's around engagement, like you talked about, promotion rates. It may also be cost savings or, ways that they've been able to redeploy talent. But what we tend to see is that it's actually the stories that wins the hearts and helps really embed the power of those programs in a broader way, because it's the stories that get reshared, not just the metrics, and what often stays with, your audience or your stakeholders.
That's where I think it is another piece of advice I have is to work closely with your employer branding colleagues, if you have them. I know not every organization has hundreds of thousands of people in that kind of resource, but a good employer value proposition and a good employer branding strategy really brings those stories alive. And it's all about, this organization gave me a chance. I had an opportunity to grow and to develop, and, the sense of pride and purpose associated with work that comes from it.
Awesome. Well, I would love to touch a little bit about your work at Emerge, because there you're almost elevating yet another level to, not just the work you're doing with these large companies, but now you're looking across the entire ecosystem of learning. And we had said before, obviously that's a complex one. Is there any emerging themes that you think others that are working in this industry should be aware of, things that are changing, advice that you might give given your vantage point at looking across the entire industry?
There was about 3 questions packed into that, I think, Christine, but I will try to
I'm very good at that, by the way.
So I've gravitated, into helping a lot of the vendors, as I was saying, and now investors, because I really care about making the greatest possible impact. And so I feel like if I can, to some extent, influence the investment decisions where the money goes, then I can maybe shape the solutions that will get us where we need to go. So that I find that really exciting. In terms of, trends for the audience that I expect is probably on this webinar today, I think it's just really, really hard to keep up. Danny Johnson from Red Thread Research, I think you know her as well, just put out a graphic of all of the solutions. Did you see that? It had
My
so many
eyes hurt, I think, because the company names got so small.
I couldn't even read the company names. I said, Danny, send me a high res image of this, please. Because so I guess where I'm going with this is, even though I'm really excited about emerging technologies, it's so hard to keep up, especially for a practitioner. That's a full-time job. You have to be doing the work in your company and keeping up. And so my advice there is, lean on external experts. I'm not trying to plug my services, but if it's not me, it's the power of the network, right? So I think together it's impossible. It's impossible to do it all and know it all right now. And actually, and I don't want to make this session about generative AI because I'm kind of sick of talking about that this week, but because of the disruption that's happening and the accelerating pace of change, right, brought about by AI, I think L&D really needs to be in the driver's seat of enabling people to experiment with this technology and figure out what are the use cases to do better work. And so where I'm going with this is I think we're going to see lots of new solutions that are trying to play in that space. But as L&D professionals, technology aside, I would be thinking about how can we create communities of practice? How can we create, even starting with ourselves, because we have to upskill ourselves first. And so who can we talk to? Who can we share with? Because the fact of the matter is nobody knows this stuff. There really are no experts.
Yeah.
I was listening to Ethan Mollick, who's a professor at Wharton, present last week in New York. And I have quite a brain crush on this guy. You should all follow him. And he was saying, L&D should be the R&D for organizations, because it's the educators, it's the learning professionals that are really well positioned to enable people to make the most of this technology. So those are kind of some things I guess. Number one, don't feel like you have to know every tech solution out there. You can't keep up. So power of the network, and lean into other people, lean into communities. And speaking of communities, how can we enable communities within companies so employees feel like they can experiment in a way that's relevant to the work that they're doing?
Yeah, and I actually have thought about this quite a bit, because AI has been such a disruptor. It feels like a big opportunity for the learning industry and folks in the learning industry, because it's this kind of moment where you've almost got like unified need, right? There's a need that the business also identifies, like, how do we upskill and make sure everybody knows how to apply this in their work and things like that. So it's actually probably one of the biggest opportunities to put learning front and center as a driver of this big seismic shift that companies are going through. So, maybe I'm always an optimist, but I felt like, gosh, it's a real opportunity to showcase how powerful learning as a function can be for an organization to really upskill people to skills that are very, very closely tied to business. Yeah.
Right. And we're not going to achieve this by just dumping content on people. Please, no e-learning modules on AI 101, this is an LLM. I'm already just breaking out in hives thinking about all of the content that's proliferating around this, that is just not helping. People need to play with this technology. They really do. And we need to be the enablers of experiences and communities. And another important aspect on the human level is we don't know what we don't know. So how can we guide people to make them really think about, who am I? What skills do I have now? What am I good at? Where do I want to go, in a way that's aligned, hopefully, with some of the company's objectives, right? And maybe it's not that company and you're meant to be elsewhere, but that's another story. But really sort of that self-awareness piece. And I think coaching in that regard and some of the work that you do at Sounding Board can be really instrumental there to help people understand, who am I? Where am I going? And then obviously to become more impactful and effective people leaders as well, to lead people through uncertainty.
Well, thank you for saying that. It's interesting. So we work with a company that, like every company today, is undergoing massive change. And, the word we used to all hear a lot was digital transformation. But they've been talking about how just through the adoption of even a solution like ours, right, where it's technology enabled, Whereas previously, this might have been done in a very manual way or a services driven way without technology. But that there was sort of a twofold effect of that. One, that they as a organization or function within the company was really showing how they were embracing a digital operating model, right? And really pulling that into all of the work that they were doing. And then as they themselves were trying to push their entire executive teams to really start to think about how they can adopt a lot of new technologies in their work, the mindset shifts that need to happen and the behavior that needs to change is also something that isn't done just through one-time exposure or course, but it's actually has to be continuous and over time and through iteration and practice. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I am really impressed with the work you're doing. And the thing I love the most, and we share this, is I think it's important to democratize access to opportunities like the coaching that your people receive, because all too often you think of the pyramid of the workforce and you have what I like to affectionately refer to as the special people at the top, these the executives, maybe the high potentials. But then when you think of the middle managers and the frontline managers, first time managers, and everybody else, what's the plan for them?
That's right.
What is the plan? And so anything out there that really gives, and not just dumping content on people, but that's giving them opportunities for coaching and mentoring and application, practice, feedback, all the things that we know as learning specialists that we are that are required to actually develop and grow and build skills, right? That's what I find exciting about the technology, because it does enable that.
Well, Amanda, if you'd believe it, we are done. It has been 30 minutes already. It always goes so fast. Is there any last parting advice or thoughts you'd want to share with folks before we go?
I believe, again, power of community, power of the network. I would love to be connected with you all and to learn from you too, and get any feedback that you have from this conversation, I guess.
Okay. Well, thank you again. I know it's late where you are, and so I hope you can have a restful evening. Thank you so much for coming again.
Thanks for having me again. It was a great conversation.